Stephen Pearce went head-to-head with Dom Dietrich in an exclusive interview with BBC Radio Derby, an interview which lasts around an hour, and I've taken all my notes from the key talking points from that interview so that I can give you a brief rundown of everything that has gone on. Now, he discusses everything from the likes of injuries, the likes of recruitment and potential investment this summer, despite we don't get any clear understanding of what is going to happen next. But shall we take a brief rundown of everything that's gone through? Now, in regards to the injuries, there is currently an injury review ongoing at the club throughout the course of the close season. There was changes made at the back end of last season since the introduction of John Eustace, but a review is continually ongoing to make sure that Derby County get the best out of the people within the building. Now, some injuries can't be helped and are unexpected, like the likes of Sondre Langas's torn meniscus, the likes of Curtis Nelson as well, but Paul Warne was consulted when the medical team was appointed. It was a club decision, but conversations were had regarding all the important members at the club, and Paul Warne was one of them. Now, Stephen Pearce was keen not to sort of dig out on any sort of individuals who had been involved in the medical department as per the League One season heading into the Championship, but wanted the best for the club and wanted whoever those people were to be the best people that Derby County had available. Now, he says that people were consulted, and I'm assuming he means the likes of Paul Warne, the likes of other people in the medical department, other people around the building as well. But ultimately, the final say came from a collective decision and not necessarily directly from the manager or directly from any of the coaches. Now, there was a little bit of a question from Dom Dietrich in regards to Derby County's former head of performance, who ultimately left and moved on to Huddersfield Town and has since, I believe, been let go of by Huddersfield Town. And obviously, Stephen Pearce, I think that's where he sort of didn't really want to talk about individuals, but those decisions have been made and changes have been rectified in order to sort of help Derby County into next season. Stephen Pearce went on to say that the head coach decision, the decision is not made for the head coach, but recommendations are made towards the head coach, recommendations are made towards the owner and things like that for what the club can do better in that regard. And that is ultimately what then happened in the second half of the season. And given our position, Derby County went on the offensive and took more risks with their players, which ultimately resulted in a player like Sondre Langas playing for essentially 2.5 months with a torn meniscus. Now, obviously, in regards to the Langas risk, Stephen Pearce was very clear and adamant on the fact that that wouldn't happen usually, and should they have had better squad depth, that wouldn't have happened anyway. But there was continual conversations with Sondre Langas, medical professionals, the head coach, to make sure that Langas wasn't at any undue risk of further injury and putting himself in a worse position for his future career, because obviously Derby County did spend £4.5 million on him. Now, Stephen Pearce was clear in the sense of that the review is not just solely based on the medical grounds of injuries, fitness and things like that. It was also related to the likes of recruitment, the likes of coaching, goalkeeper coaching, everything across the board. And Eustace will now sort of get to have his say on what Derby County do going forward, whether that be in the medical department, in the recruitment department, obviously in his own coaching setup, as we've seen earlier on today, which I'll get into in a moment. But it's starting to feel like John Eustace is starting to be able to put his stamp on this Derby County club. Now, as I mentioned, John Eustace has been able to start to have his say, and we saw him bring in Keith Downing, Matt Gardner, Steve Round and Paul Clements as his coaches, and Jake Buxton stepped up to the first team to not only help with the progression from those players in the under-21s, but also help with the first team as well. And a decision has been made by Derby County to bring back Paul Clements for the next few seasons as Derby County's head of goalkeeping, where he'll oversee the first team, the academy, and sort of be a part of that structure going forwards. And obviously, he's a man who John Eustace brought in just a few days after he arrived at the club, with obviously Andy Warrington moving on to pastures new. We then went on into a discussion regarding recruitment, where Stephen Pearce, as we all expect, went on to talk about how really difficult a transfer window is, especially as a newly promoted club, due to the risk of relegation and the financial implications that has on players. And that's something that the club weren't prepared to go against. Now, I'm assuming in that regard, when it comes to financial risk, I'm assuming that Derby County put caps in players' wages, where if they went down, wages went down by 25%. We've heard previous professional players, the likes of Ben Foster, discuss these conversations that clubs have with players, and obviously that's something which can have an impact on a player's career, because you come in, probably get your best wage, and then if you get relegated, you go probably back down to less than what you was getting before, and that sort of changes the conversation that is there. And obviously some players will have had sort of like relegation release clauses, which would have then helped Derby County recoup money, but also meant that they would only have been here for a year or 6 months, depending on who those players were. But there was no sort of talk about which players those were. But Stephen Pearce went on to be really, really confident in saying that John Eustace takes away a lot of that worry in a range of different respects when it comes to obviously the performance the team put in the second half of the season, and sort of how that looks to any potential incoming players, the quality that John Eustace has as a manager around him with his coaches, and that's something which helps bring in players, which ultimately, in my opinion, doesn't come from Stephen Pearce, but in my opinion, we didn't have that back in when it came to Paul Warne last summer, because anybody that looks at Paul Warne's record in the Championship would see that he'd been relegated every time he'd been in the league, apart from the one season where he stepped away from Rotherham to come and join Derby County. Now, Stephen Pearce was keen to point out that Derby County have to be flexible in the window to make sure they get the right targets. He obviously went on to make a comment which some people haven't been very happy with, where he discusses that they bring in the squad depth players earlier because they're the easier players to bring in, and the more permanent, high-quality targets obviously come on later down the line. Now, a lot of people have been very disappointed in that comment, saying it's not really a good sort of thing to put out to those players that you're discussing with at the moment. But in my opinion, I don't think it makes any difference. Derby County will be having those conversations with the players. John Eustace will make it clear what that player is coming in to do and what their job will be and the aspect that they will have in the Derby County squad. So I don't necessarily think it's a big problem. Now, he went on to talk about January, and he believes, I do agree with him as well, that Derby County came out of the January window better than they did before. Obviously didn't expect Nelson to pick up his injury and didn't expect Brighton to come in for Cashin with a bid at the size that they did, which obviously meant that Erin Cashin moved on to pastures new, and obviously Curtis Nelson isn't now available until probably October, I reckon. And they think that the signings of the likes of Langas, Matt Clark, Lars-Jørgen Selvson and Harrison Armstrong were big deals for Derby County and obviously made the team a lot better. Went on to discuss the signings of Langas and Selvson and said they weren't on the radar for the January transfer window, but given the position Derby County found themselves in, it sort of felt as if it was a deal that they had to get done early, and it was a big learning curve for the club where they sort of felt as if they were more a victim of circumstance when it came down to injuries and players leaving like James Collins, and obviously Cashin leaving, Nelson leaving, and they think in future when they're going to bring in players from that sort of region, it's going to be more of a progressive signing where they get the chance to sort of breed themselves into English football rather than being chucked straight in at the deep end like Langas and Selvison both were. Now, the club were aware of both players and had been watching them for about 9 months prior to signing for Derby County, but it wasn't a deal they could get done in the summer as Paul Warne was happy with what he had. Now, we'll get onto that in a little bit later, but they want to be a bit more proactive next time, and obviously it didn't quite go the way they wanted, obviously with Selvison having to have surgery and Langas obviously having to have surgery over the course of the last few weeks. Now, in the January window, there was discussions about how long it took Derby County to get deals done, and obviously they wanted to get more business done, but they felt like the business they did was great for the club and helped them move forward. But they were clear on the fact that you have to be, when you're sustainable, you have to wait for these deals to fall into place, and ultimately that is what they did. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier in regards to Paul Warne being happy with what he had. Once Derby County had signed Jerry Yates in the summer, Collins had renewed his contract and Dejan Brown was in the building, Paul Warne told the board that he was happy with what he had in that forward department, so they wasn't going out to look for another striker. But once we got into the season, it was made clear by Paul Warne and his coaching staff that that was what he needed in the January window, and the budget was put in place for Paul Warne to go ahead and do that, but ultimately struggled to still get players over the line in the January window. Stephen Pearce Pearce was keen to make it clear that they're aiming to minimise mistakes heading into the next transfer windows coming up, and obviously attracting players now will be very, very much easier heading into the second season in the Championship, and with the grounding and base of John Eustace, which we saw in the second half of that season, where John Eustace essentially doubled Derby County's points tally in 2 months, less than a quarter of the games in a season. Now, the sale of Erin Cashin did not contribute to sacking Paul Warne or bringing in John Eustace, but it did contribute to the signing of Sondre Langas. Of the Cashin budget, there is about £6 million remaining, as Dom Dietrich suggested to Stephen Pearce and did not back. And that is available for John Eustace to use this summer. Pearce holds the cards when it comes to negotiating with other teams, but it is a team effort to make sure that these deals are correct and put in place correctly. Now, he has been doing that for 20 years in football. No transfer was forced on Paul Warne. No transfer was forced on, obviously, the head of John Eustace. But lots of conversations are had to make a final decision on what the best thing is for Derby County Football Club going forward. Now, Pearce does not have final say on player signings or anything like that, but he does get a lot of experts from those people. He does get a lot of information from experts below him who help him make the right decision, in a sense. Now, Leigh Bromby, who was appointed a few weeks ago, I made a video about that, will be working alongside Stephen Pearce in that capacity to sort of make contact with scouts, analysts, coaching teams and things like that, to sort of add some extra experience to Derby County and make these sort of deals go through a little bit smoother. Now, Stephen Pearce was keen to point out that the model Derby County have introduced over the course of the last 12 months is now being looked at by other clubs, most notably in the sort of Everton in the Premier League, and they're all trying to implement their model in the same way that Derby County have, because there's a lot to do in some of the roles that some people have done on their own over recent years. And as much as it isn't done at every club, Derby County don't have the resources to get the right man in right now, so it's better to have a lot of different bodies helping to get those decisions right, rather than just putting sole focus on one man. Now, he went on to talk about Ed Smith and Mo Babbitt and how they've been involved in the process at the club, and what he was keen to make sure everybody knew was that they aren't involved in final decisions on transfers, training, coaching, staffing, playing positions or anything like that. They're just fully involved in making sure that the process runs smoothly at the club and everyone understands what they're doing. And Stephen Pearce does believe that Derby County are already starting to see the fruits of that work already. But he did go on to say that you can't sustainably buy Championship experience consistently, obviously in the Championship, because if you buy Championship experience, you normally buy high and pay high wages. And obviously we got a really good deal on that on Matt Clark. We got some really good deals this 2 transfer windows just gone, but ultimately we need a bit more, and that's what Derby County will be looking for heading into the summer. And Stephen Pearce believes that the deal to bring in Nat Phillips was an absolute steal. Now, I do have a video coming out later on today about Nat Phillips, discussing the potential for Derby County to sign him. Now, in that video, Stephen Pearce hadn't done his interview, and Stephen Pearce has sort of put it forward that Nat Phillips has another year on his contract at Liverpool, but ultimately nowhere else suggests that, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with that one. Now, let's get on to the sacking of Paul Warne, and there's 2 parts to this, because Stephen Pearce says that the sacking wasn't harsh of Paul Warne, and the way it was done ultimately wasn't harsh. They tried to do the best thing based on the values of the club by removing him from his position heading into that game with Norwich City. They didn't want to give Paul Warne that sort of situation where he didn't really know where he stood heading into that weekend, obviously with him staying up with his family after the game and things like that, and they felt that it was the right thing to do, despite the fact that many people maybe didn't agree with the way they handled it. Now, obviously, when bringing in Paul Warne, the aim was to get out of League One, and obviously he did that successfully. The hope was that it would work going on into the Championship, but ultimately we all saw with our own eyes, and a lot of us anticipated it, including myself, that it wasn't going to work, and it didn't, and the change was made. And Pearce and David Clowes made the decision that they didn't think it was right for Paul Warne to manage against his hometown club, with his family in the stands, with all the sort of negative sort of connotations going on, and then obviously him staying up there with his family afterwards, he just felt that it was right to make that decision on the Friday morning that I think it was, before Derby County headed up to Norwich City for that away game. And should it have happened earlier? Who knows? But the conversation around Pearce and Warne seems to state that the relationships are great between Pearce, Clowes, Warne and that coaching cohort, and he wishes them the best of luck in their new positions. Obviously, Paul Warne now at MK Dons with Richie Barker, Matt Hamshaw and Andy Warrington at Rotherham. Now, should it have happened earlier? Now, that is a question. Now, I will go into that a little bit more in a moment, but let's just finish on Paul Warne, where Pearce says that Paul Warne was given everything that he asked for, and Paul Warne gave everything back to the club, and the window that Derby County were involved in under Paul Warne and the signings were all agreed by Paul Warne. And he then went on to discuss how that same squad of players doubled their points under John Eustace than what Paul Warne managed earlier on in the season. And obviously that is a discussion to be had. Stephen Pearce did go on to say that the club could have made the decision earlier, but they don't believe that they'd have got John Eustace in had that have happened. Now let's get on to that John Eustace appointment, because the club did want Eustace and they don't believe that it would have happened earlier based on whatever they had in front of them, whatever conversations they'd have, and ultimately that was obviously the problem. Now, they don't believe they would have got John Eustace without waiting for those transfer decisions to be made at Blackburn Rovers, with obviously the position Blackburn were in comparison to Derby County, and that obviously causes problems in its own right. But they've already started to work on next season, and obviously We've spoke about what John Eustace did as Derby County manager. It was unbelievable. A really, really good job as manager. And what they've done since the end of the season, they've sat down a few times to make sure that they're getting the right players for John Eustace, the play style, the philosophy, what he wants in characters and things like that. And that isn't just done as John Eustace and Stephen Pearce. It's done as a collective, as a club, and everybody gets a say. Now, he did make it clear that some people might not agree with the decisions that are made, but it is a collective decision. And you don't want yes men, you don't want everybody to agree with what you're saying. And that's what I sort of like by what Stephen Pearce was saying in this interview, because it doesn't feel like they're in a boardroom of people that just say, yes, let's just do that. That works with me. Like, people are willing to have those competitive arguments and disagreements to get the best thing for Derby County. Now, it was asked about how Stephen Pearce and David Clowes proposed Derby County to John Eustace, given the situation that they were in, and how John Eustace has discussed investment and things like that. Now, Stephen Pearce made it clear that the plan that John Eustace was given was the plan that was already there, that was in front of Paul Warne and things like that, and there wasn't any commitment regarding any outside investment, and this isn't about Derby County buying their way to the Premier League. Now, Stephen Pearce was keen to point out that Eustace has never worked with big budgets at his previous clubs, whether that be Birmingham, whether it be Blackburn Rovers or any other job that he's had. So he doesn't see it as a problem. Now, there is hope for additional investment, which would obviously be good, but Stephen Pearce could not give any any entailment on how long that's going to be or when it will come, as conversations are ongoing behind the scenes with David Clowes. Now, Clowes is still 100% owner, as we know. No decision has been made, and that's what Eustace is backed by right now, and Eustace is completely happy with that. Stephen Pearce said it didn't really need much selling as a club, because John Eustace knew exactly what the club was and knew exactly what the club was aiming to do and where they sort of wanted to end up. And Stephen Pearce made it clear that John Eustace's agency isn't stupid. If this club wasn't the right move, he absolutely would not be at Derby County right now. And I think he said that if it's as bad as what people try and make it out to be in the public eye, then why would Eustace have come to the club? Why would the agency have allowed John Eustace to do that? And I think that is a very, very good spin that Stephen Pearce has put on that. Now, John Eustace has bought into the club plan, and Stephen Pearce and David Clowes both believe that Eustace is that next level to Paul Warne, where he can do the same in the Championship as Paul Warne did in League One. Now, yes, John Eustace doesn't have any promotions out of the Championship, but ultimately, every time he's managed a team, he's had them battling for the playoffs in the second season after escaping relegation the season before, which I think certainly shows the level. Now, Stephen Pearce felt it was certain that we'd stay up as a club. with the way that John Eustace works with his coaching cohort, the organisation of the players on and off the pitch, and the high standards that he sets for people around the club, whether that be players, whether that be staff and things like that. And he thinks it was an excellent appointment. He's an excellent coach, and the backroom staff all compliment him well. And the introduction of Steve Round in that sort of consultancy role just shows the quality that John Eustace can get behind him. And Stephen Pearce thinks John Eustace is a top-class leader and knows what standards he wants and how high they have to be able to be a top-class club at this level. And John Eustace has changed the way things are operating at the club in order to maximise the club. And John Eustace is in early morning to late at night, and everybody's there wants to fight for John Eustace, will break through a brick wall for him to make this club move differently. Now, there was a lot of conversation. Now, this is going to be a very long video. I do apologise. We're 20 minutes in already. Now, there was a lot of conversation about Pearce's accountability in regards to Paul Warne's start to the season in the Championship, some of the transfer window things. And Stephen Pearce says that Paul Warne wasn't necessarily a failure because the long-term plan was to get back into the Championship, of which he succeeded. But things did go wrong, and Stephen Pearce acknowledged that results did speak for themselves. And Pearce holds accountability to those above him. Now, he did make it clear that he made the call regarding John Eustace, said that we should go and get him, and that was the right call to make. And he said it's a 50-50 in regards to his role, because anything negative that happens, he holds accountability for. Anything positive that happens, he holds accountability for. Now, the introduction of Paul Warne got Derby County out of League One. Positive. It also then nearly got us relegated, but didn't, due to the decision to sack him and bring in John Eustace. There's another positive. If we had have gotten relegated, Stephen Pearce believes, yes, he would have been held accountable, as it would have been his decision. Now, he prefers to keep things behind the scenes and let the more football-y people do their jobs while he runs the club day to day. Now, it's not, he said it wasn't easy to have chance about himself while obviously living in the area, working in the area on a day-to-day basis, but he did feel a lot of support from fans, in which he met at fans forums and around obviously the city of Derby, and that obviously sort of helped him realise that what he was doing at the club and the positives that he sees, a lot of people are seeing as well. And the vast majority, he says, seems to be supportive of himself and Klaus. He does take the positives from those fans and accepts there'll always be negatives no matter what he sort of chooses to do, but he is giving 100% to make it work at Derby County and to help the club get back to exactly where they was, and maybe even higher, despite everything they've been through. Now, he does say that he can't control the trust of the fans, but he aims to show them exactly how much he loves this club and how much he wants to push Derby County forward with the move the club makes, whether that be in the summer transfer window, whether that be with the coaching staff, the academy and things like that. And he thinks that with the introduction of John Eustace, the arrival of Steve Round in that consultancy role, he thinks it was brilliant to see that base that they have is so solid moving forward. And he says it was really good to see the elation from the fans after that final game at Stoke City, in which Derby County stayed in the division. And obviously the club is growing, which is shown by a range of the appointments made with obviously John Eustace, and Stephen Pearce was keen to make that clear. Now, Stephen Pearce doesn't want to step away due to the progress the club have made post-administration, and he says that the club is now run by him day to day. He'll make recommendations to David Klaus, but obviously Stephen Pearce does not have solid decision-making capacity, and that comes from above. Now, there was conversations regarding Jonathan Price, who worked with Mel Morris previously, but is now working with David Klaus. Jonathan Price is at Derby County in an advisor role to David Klaus, with the aim to sort of help in regards to those investment discussions. Now, Jonathan Price, according to Stephen Pearce, has made no decisions around the football club, has not made any decisions regarding the first team or club, as per Stephen Pearce. He does have to have that insider information so that he is able to talk to investors moving forward to be able to make those sort of investment calls happen. And obviously then that does involve sort of Stephen Pearce later down the line. But right now, Jonathan Price does not have any direct control over anything going on at Derby County, and the links with Mel Morris were purely in an investment standpoint, and are the same with David Klaus now. There was a question asked in regard to Jonathan Price having a say in the decision made for Paul Warne being sacked, and Stephen Pearce denied that wholeheartedly. He says that there is no secret in regards to Jonathan Price's involvement with the club. Price got Klaus to the table for Klaus to buy the stadium, and then got David Klaus to buy the club out of administration as well, which was brilliant. And Stephen Pearce has said that they have to dream. They had to dream and got to believe in Eustace at the end of that sort of period where they brought him in and they felt that he was the best option. And that was sort of at the end of this sort of conversation regarding Jonathan Price as the advisor to David Klaus. Now, it's a weird one, the David Klaus, Jonathan Price conversation, because obviously Price has involvement with Mel Morris, but if he helps us get in some good investments, I'm not going to complain. Now, onto the investment front. Now, I think it's strategic that Stephen Pearce has done this interview and not David Klaus, because Stephen Pearce makes it clear in the first question that he has no involvement in the conversations until the due diligence is done later on. There is a data room which any of these investors can look at, which he keeps updated on a day-to-day basis to make sure that it's ready for anybody who is willing to look at that. But Pearce doesn't know anything in that sort of perspective as of right now. And he is operating as if David Klaus runs the show, and until things change, that's exactly how it will be. Now, Pearce won't comment on any investment parties or takeover groups or anything like that, as it's Klaus's discussion to have, and he will stay until he's told not to, essentially. And he seems to like what Derby County are building, loves the club, knows that things can change in an instant in football and he could be gone. But as of right now, Pearce is not aware of the status from Klaus as chairman or whatever that is, should a takeover go through. I think it's really important that we make it clear that Stephen Pearce has made it clear he does not have any involvement in any investment discussions. So until that is done, he doesn't know anything. And I probably doubt we'll hear from David Klaus this summer, but we'll obviously have to wait and see. They then went on to look ahead to the summer transfer window. There is contracts on the table for Craig Forsyth and Liam Thompson, but it's all in the hands of the player to make that final decision. They don't want to get carried away with any targets for this summer, but by targets, I mean finished position for next season. But the club is happy with the base and the way they ended last season. And the squad will be strengthened this year. The budget is reportedly bigger than it was last year. And they won't put a position on where they want to finish, but they are hoping to improve and finish higher up than they did last year, and hopefully without it going to the final day. The club have held discussions already with other clubs and players, probably some of the players which I've spoke about over the course of the last few days, ahead of summer transfer moves, but no, obviously, decisions have been made, otherwise we'd probably have been made aware of it. Targets have been addressed by John Eustace and by the club, and they are obviously assessing their options. And he wanted to reiterate that early doors, the players that Derby County sign will be squad depth options, and you'll see the higher quality players come through the door towards the end of the summer. But we are expecting another busy summer. And that is the end of that from the interview between Stephen Pearce and Dom Dietrich of BBC Radio Derby. I think it was a decent one. I think we learned a lot from Stephen Pearce. Obviously, there is a lot of PR spin on a lot of the questions, and I do think that a lot of the time he didn't really answer the question. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. It was a 55-minute interview. I've cut it down to 28 minutes for you as of my recording on my right-hand side. And yeah, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you have not done so already, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, turn on the notification bell, and I'll catch you in my next video later on today.